On the coldest night of the year, when even the streetlights seemed to freeze in place, 73-year-old Dorothy Williams heard 3 desperate knocks on her door that would shatter everything she thought she knew about humanity. Behind that door stood a towering Hell's Angel clutching a dying newborn, and her decision in the next 10 seconds would either save 3 lives or destroy them all. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. Now let's begin. The blizzard had descended upon Riverside like a vengeful beast, swallowing the small town whole. Power lines snapped under sheets of ice, plunging entire neighborhoods into Arctic darkness. Cars sat buried beneath mountains of white, their owners trapped inside homes that grew colder by the hour. But in the modest 2-story house on Cedar Lane, a warm golden glow fought back against the storm. Dorothy moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned that every movement mattered when you were alone. Her weathered hands fed another log into the old cast-iron stove that had been her lifeline through 8 winters of widowhood. The silence pressed against her like a physical weight. Robert's absence still echoed through every corner of their home, even 3 years after the cancer had taken him. Their son Brandon had made it clear that visits were purely transactional now, appearing only when his gambling debts mounted too high. His wife Crystal standing behind him, with calculating eyes that seemed to appraise every piece of furniture for its resale value. Dorothy's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece where Robert's military photo smiled back at her, his dress uniform crisp and proud. Beside it sat a small music box he had bought for their first anniversary. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, lay a tiny pair of hand-knitted baby shoes in soft blue, the only tangible reminder of the grandson she had held for 2 precious weeks before pneumonia stole him away. The pounding on her door cut through the howling wind like a gunshot, followed immediately by the heart-wrenching wail of an infant whose cries seemed to pierce straight through Dorothy's soul. Through the ice-covered window, Dorothy could make out 2 figures huddled against the merciless wind. The larger figure was enormous, broad shoulders straining against a leather jacket covered in patches she couldn't make out in the darkness. But it was the desperate, gravelly voice that made her chest tighten with recognition of pure parental terror. "Please, ma'am." The voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. "My baby can't take much more of this cold. Please, we just need somewhere warm for her." Behind the man stood a young woman who couldn't have been more than 23, her thin frame shaking so violently that Dorothy could see it through the glass. Her inadequate coat was soaked through, and her face was pale with hypothermia. "We've knocked on 6 other houses already," the woman called out, her voice breaking. One man saw Tony's jacket and slammed the door before we could even speak. "Please, I'm begging you. My daughter is only 4 weeks old, and she's so cold I can barely feel her breathing anymore." Dorothy's hand hovered over the deadbolt, her mind racing through decades of warnings about strangers in the night, about leather-clad bikers and the violence they supposedly carried with them. But as the baby's cries grew weaker, more desperate, every maternal instinct that had been dormant since her grandson's death came roaring back to life. This wasn't about her safety anymore. This was about a child who was dying in the cold while adults made judgments based on appearances. The deadbolt turned with a click that seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot. Dorothy pulled the door open wide, letting the precious warmth from her kitchen spill out into the frozen night like an offering. "Get inside, all of you, right now," she said, her voice carrying the gentle but absolute authority she had used during 30 years of teaching elementary school. No child should be out in weather like this. The man stepped across her threshold first, immediately unwrapping layers of blankets from around the infant with hands that shook, not from cold but from fear. "Thank you so much, ma'am. I'm Tony Rodriguez, and this is my wife, Sarah, and our daughter, Emma. We were coming back from a rally in Colorado when this storm came out of nowhere." Sarah stumbled inside behind him, her teeth chattering violently, but her eyes never left the baby as Tony placed the tiny bundle into Dorothy's waiting arms. The moment Dorothy cradled little Emma against her chest, feeling the child's tiny body gradually stop shivering as warmth began to seep in her bones, something fundamental shifted inside her. The baby's features, the delicate curve of her eyebrows, the way her tiny fist curled against Dorothy's sweater, reminded her so strongly of her grandson that tears sprang to her eyes. "Sweet little angel," she murmured, automatically beginning the gentle swaying motion that came as naturally as breathing. "You're safe now, precious girl. You're going to be just fine." As Sarah positioned herself close to the wood stove, Dorothy began the familiar ritual of caring for others that had defined most of her adult life. She heated water, preparing a bottle with formula. She kept stock for the occasional visits from church members with young children. Her movements were swift and sure, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought might have faltered. Most people see Tony's jacket, see those Hell's Angels patches, and they assume we're trouble, Sarah said, accepting the cup of hot tea Dorothy pressed in her hands. Her voice was soft, educated, not what Dorothy had expected. "They don't see that he's the gentlest man I've ever known, that he works double shifts at the auto shop to support us, that he's never raised his voice to me, not once in the 3 years we've been together." Dorothy settled in her favorite rocking chair, adjusting her hold on Emma so she could feed the baby while keeping her warm. "People are too quick to judge based on appearances," she said softly, watching the baby's eyes grow heavy with contentment. "They see leather and tattoos and think they know a person's whole story, but they miss the love in a father's eyes when he's protecting a child." Tony had been silent since they'd entered, but now he spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never been so scared in my life," he admitted. "When Emma started turning blue in the car, when we couldn't find anywhere to warm her up, I thought we were going to lose her." Dorothy looked down at Emma's tiny face, now pink with warmth, and felt that familiar ache in her chest, the one that had never quite healed since her grandson's death. "I had a grandson once," she found herself saying, her voice quiet. "He had eyes just like Emma's, and the sweetest little smile. I only had him for 2 weeks before pneumonia took him. The doctor said there was nothing anyone could have done, but—" She trailed off, then looked up at Tony and Sarah with fierce determination. "I couldn't save my grandson, but I can make sure your little girl stays warm and safe tonight. Sometimes God gives us second chances to do right by the children who need us." Sarah reached for Dorothy's hand, her fingers still cold but warming. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice breaking with gratitude. "But you did. I don't know how to thank you." Dorothy smiled, brushing a damp curl from Emma's forehead. "Don't thank me yet. Just keep her safe and loved. That's all any child really needs." The fire crackled, filling the room with steady, living warmth. Outside, the blizzard raged on with supernatural fury, but inside, love held the cold at bay. Tony sat in Robert's old chair, his intimidating exterior completely dissolved as he watched his daughter feed contentedly in the arms of the woman who had saved her life. Sarah curled up on the couch, finally allowing exhaustion to take her as she watched her family safe and warm. Dorothy rocked slowly, holding Emma close, and for the first time in 3 years, the house didn't feel empty. The storm had burned itself out by dawn, leaving Riverside buried under a pristine blanket of snow that sparkled like diamonds in the weak morning sun. Dorothy stood at her kitchen window, watching Tony load their few belongings into a beat-up sedan that somehow still ran despite its obvious age. Sarah appeared beside her, holding Emma bundled in the warmest clothes Dorothy had been able to find. The baby was alert now, her bright eyes taking in this new world of warmth and safety. "How can we ever repay you?" Sarah asked, her voice still hoarse from the night's ordeal. Dorothy shook her head. "You don't repay kindness. You pass it forward." Tony approached them, his leather jacket back in place, but somehow looking less intimidating in the morning light. He paused in front of Dorothy, his expression serious. "Most of this town shut their doors on us last night," he said quietly. "But you open yours. Hell's Angels don't forget that kind of loyalty. I'll come back to check on you. That's a promise." Sarah stepped forward, pulling out a small braided bracelet from her coat pocket. "I made this for Emma," she said, nodding toward the baby. "But I want you to have it, so you'll remember that you saved a life last night." Dorothy slipped the bracelet over her wrist, the bright colors standing out against her dark skin. She watched as they made their way down the snow-covered street, their figures growing smaller until the brilliant white landscape swallowed them from sight. But their story was far from over. 1 week later, Dorothy heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles turning onto Cedar Lane. But instead of the single bike she expected, the sound multiplied until her entire house seemed to vibrate with mechanical thunder. She stepped on her front porch and gasped. More than a dozen motorcycles lined her street, their chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. Men and women in leather jackets dismounted with military precision. But these weren't the dangerous criminals she had been warned about her entire life. They moved with respect, with purpose, carrying toolboxes and bags of supplies. Tony walked up her front path with a confident stride, but today he looked nothing like the desperate father from that storm night. Behind him, Sarah carried Emma, the baby now visibly bigger and healthier, her cheeks rosy with vitality. "Mrs. Williams," Tony called out as he reached her front steps. "We wanted to come see you properly, to explain some things that might help you understand why what you did meant so much to us." Dorothy opened her door wide, ushering them into her kitchen with the same bustling hospitality she had shown a week ago. As Sarah settled Emma into the old high chair that had been gathering dust since Brandon was small, Dorothy marveled at how much the baby had grown in just 7 days. Tony cleared his throat and reached into his shirt pocket, withdrawing a thick white envelope. "Before we say anything else, I need to explain something about who we really are," he began. "The Hells Angels aren't what most people think we are, at least not our chapter. We're motorcycle enthusiasts who love the freedom of the open road and the brotherhood that comes from sharing that passion. But more than that, we're a family." Sarah nodded, bouncing Emma gently on her knee. "We're not criminals or troublemakers," she said, her eyes meeting Dorothy's with direct honesty. "Tony works as a mechanic at Rodriguez Auto downtown, and I teach music lessons to children in our neighborhood. We ride with the Angels because they're our chosen family, because they share our values about loyalty and helping people who need it." Tony gestured toward the envelope with something approaching reverence. "That night during the blizzard, when you opened your door and saved our daughter's life, you didn't just help one family," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "You helped our entire extended family, because every member of our chapter considers Emma to be their niece. When word got out about what you did, the whole group wanted to find a way to thank you properly." Inside the envelope, Dorothy found more money than she had seen in one place since Robert's life insurance payout 3 years ago, along with a handwritten note explaining that the funds had been collected during a charity ride, with every member contributing whatever they could afford. "This is too much," Dorothy whispered, her hands shaking as she tried to hand the envelope back. "I didn't help you because I expected any reward. I helped because it was the right thing to do." Tony shook his head with gentle stubbornness. "This isn't about what you expected or what we owe," he said firmly. "This is about what our community values and how we choose to honor people who embody those values. You showed us that there are still people in this world who judge others by their actions rather than their appearances." Sarah leaned forward earnestly. "Besides the money, we'd like to do some work around your house if you'll let us," she said, gesturing toward the window where Dorothy could see several bikers unpacking tools and equipment. "We've got carpenters and painters and electricians in our group, all professionals who are eager to donate their time and skills." Little Emma began to fuss, reaching her tiny arms toward Dorothy with obvious recognition. Dorothy's heart melted completely as she lifted the baby into her arms, feeling the solid weight of a healthy child settling against her chest. "My goodness, sweet pea," she murmured. "Look how much you've grown in just 1 week." Emma's response was a delighted giggle that filled the kitchen with pure joy, and Dorothy found herself laughing along, tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks as she realized how much she had missed having a child in her arms. 3 days later, Dorothy stood in the lobby of Rainbow Children's Home with 4 large shopping bags and a heart full of purpose. The orphanage sat on the outskirts of town, a converted Victorian mansion that housed 37 children with funding that never seemed adequate for their needs. She had called ahead to speak with director Linda Patterson, who had been running the facility for over 15 years with more love than resources. "Mrs. Williams." The chorus of young voices that greeted her arrival made Dorothy's face light up with genuine happiness. "Grandma Dorothy," called out a girl of about 8, whose gap-toothed grin reminded Dorothy painfully of Brandon at the same age. Dorothy unpacked warm blankets in bright colors, cases of baby formula and children's vitamins, educational toys and books that would last through the winter. At the bottom of the 4th bag was an envelope containing enough money to repair the ancient heating system that had been limping along on prayers and duct tape. "This is going to save us, Dorothy," Linda said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "This is going to save our whole winter." But even as Dorothy basked in the satisfaction of helping people who truly needed it, she couldn't shake the awareness that her generous actions were being discussed in less flattering terms throughout the rest of the small town. The sight of Hell's Angels motorcycles parked outside her house for 3 days running had not gone unnoticed by neighbors who believed that associating with the wrong sort of people reflected poorly on one's character, regardless of circumstances. The gossip that floated through town like smoke on a still day eventually found its way to a cramped apartment across town, where Brandon Williams sat nursing his third beer of the afternoon while his wife Crystal paced the small living room like a caged animal. "Your mother's been keeping company with a bunch of bikers," Crystal announced, her voice sharp with that peculiar satisfaction that comes from delivering bad news. "They fixed up her roof, gave her money too, from what I hear. Probably hiding it somewhere in that old house of hers." Brandon had been staring at the television without really seeing it, but Crystal's words seemed to strike something deep inside him. He set down his beer with deliberate care, his jaw tightening in a way Crystal recognized as dangerous. "That's interesting," he said slowly. "Real interesting." Crystal's eyes glittered as she sensed an opportunity. "Funny, isn't it? Those bikers get to play hero, and her own son gets nothing." Later that night, at Murphy's Tavern where Brandon spent most of his evenings drowning his failures in cheap whiskey, the haze of cigarette smoke wrapped around the smell of spilled beer like a funeral shroud. Crystal leaned close to him in their corner booth, her nails drumming lazily against the scarred wooden table. "It's not fair, you know," she murmured, her voice taking on that wheedling tone that always preceded her worst ideas. "Those strangers get treated like royalty, and you, her own flesh and blood, get treated like dirt. Meanwhile, she's sitting on all that money they gave her." Brandon stared at the amber liquid in his glass, his vision slightly blurred from too much alcohol and too little sleep. "That house should be mine," he said finally, his words slurring slightly. "Everything in it should be mine. I'm her son." Crystal's smile was sharp as a blade. "Exactly. And if she's not going to share willingly?" The implication hung between them like poison gas. It was well past midnight when they stumbled up the front walk to Dorothy's house, their footsteps uneven on the icy path. The repairs the Hells Angels had made were visible even in the darkness. New shingles gleaming faintly, fresh paint on the shutters, a front porch that no longer sagged under the weight of neglect. Crystal stepped through the front gate first, her heels clicking on the walkway like counting down to an execution. She looked up at the modest house and let out a harsh laugh. "This is it. This is what you're so worked up about." Brandon fumbled with his key. Dorothy had never changed the locks, had never imagined she would need to keep her own son out. Inside, the familiar smell of wood smoke and vanilla candles brought back memories he had spent years trying to forget. He moved through the narrow hallway with the careful deliberation of someone trying to hide their intoxication, opening drawers and pushing aside boxes with hands that shook for more than just the cold. His movements were clumsy, destructive, driven by a rage he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. He stopped when his eyes fell on a framed wedding photograph sitting atop the old wooden cabinet. His father in his dress uniform, his mother in white, both smiling with a happiness Brandon had never managed to find for himself. His hand hovered above the frame, fingers curling with hesitation. Crystal came up behind him and snatched the photograph before he could decide, her movements swift and cruel. With deliberate malice, she tore the picture clean down the middle, the sound of ripping paper cutting through the air like a physical wound. "Don't go soft now," she said coldly, dropping the torn halves to the floor. "You need money, not memories." Brandon stared at the destroyed photograph, something unreadable flickering across his face before alcohol drowned it again. With a roar of frustrated rage, he drove his fist into the cabinet door, the wood splintering under the impact with a sound like breaking bones. "Brandon." Dorothy's voice was low but steady as she appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her faded blue bathrobe, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. She knelt to gather the torn pieces of the photograph, cradling them in her hands as though they were something still alive. "That was your father and me on our wedding day," she said quietly, not looking up from the damaged picture. "It's all I have left of him." Brandon looked away, his jaw set in stubborn defiance. "You got plenty left, Ma. That money those bikers gave you, for starters." Dorothy straightened slowly, holding the photograph to her chest. I kept only a small portion of what they gave me, she said with quiet dignity. The rest went to the children's home, to kids who have nobody else to care about them. Brandon let out a bitter laugh that held no humor whatsoever. The orphanage? Jesus, Ma, you're still trying to save the whole world, aren't you? Still playing the saint while your own son struggles to pay rent. Her eyes softened despite the cruelty in his voice. I want you to be happy, Brandon. I want you to live the kind of life your father would have been proud of. Like you used to when you were a boy who would run home from school just to tell me about your day. But Brandon was already shaking his head, the moment of potential connection slipping past him like water through his fingers. This house is mine, he said flatly, his eyes hard with selfish determination. One way or another, it's going to be mine. Crystal's hand slipped possessively into the crook of his arm, her smirk returning as if the conversation had already been decided in their favor. When they finally stumbled back out into the night, leaving the front door hanging open like a wound, Dorothy stood alone in her violated living room. The cabinet's broken door gaped open, papers scattered across the floor, and the torn wedding photograph lay in pieces at her feet. She lowered herself into the chair by the dying fire, the wood crackling softly, and let her tears fall without shame or attempt at concealment. In the dim light, her fingers traced the faces in the photograph, lingering on Robert's eyes before moving to the image of the boy Brandon had once been. I gave you everything I had, she whispered to the empty room. I worked 3 jobs to keep you in school, sold my mother's jewelry to pay for your college, and you come back to me as a stranger. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny prayers, and Dorothy pulled Robert's old Afghan around her shoulders, preparing to spend the rest of the night keeping vigil over the ruins of her family. But she wouldn't have to keep watch alone. The next morning brought the familiar rumble of motorcycles to Cedar Lane, but this time the sound carried a different quality. Urgent, protective, like distant thunder promising a storm. Dorothy had barely managed to straighten up the living room when she heard Tony's voice calling from the front porch. Mrs. Williams? Dorothy, are you okay? She opened the door to find not just Tony and Sarah, but 6 other members of the Hells Angels, their faces grim with concern. Tony's eyes immediately took in the damage visible through the doorway, the broken cabinet, the scattered papers, the general air of violation that clung to the house like smoke. What happened here? He asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Before Dorothy could answer, the sound of footsteps on the front porch announced Brandon's return. He appeared in the doorway, obviously hungover and still reeking of alcohol, Crystal close behind him with her arms full of Dorothy's belongings. Well, Crystal said mockingly, taking in the assembled bikers with obvious disdain. Look what the cat dragged in. Come to play hero again. Tony stepped forward, positioning himself between Dorothy and the intruders, his posture radiating quiet menace. This woman saved my family when your entire town slammed doors in our faces, he said, his voice deadly calm. She's under our protection now. You want to get to her, you go through us first. Brandon started to puff out his chest, his shoulders squaring as if to confront Tony, but something in the biker's eyes, something absolutely implacable, made him hesitate. This wasn't the desperate father from the storm night. This was a man defending his chosen family, and the difference was as stark as lightning. Without breaking eye contact, Tony pulled out his phone and made a brief call. Code Blue on Cedar Lane, was all he said. Within minutes, the sound of approaching engines grew in the distance. 1, then 3, then more, until the entire street vibrated with the deep, rolling thunder of over 24 motorcycles. The rest of the Hells Angels chapter had been preparing for their weekly charity ride, and they arrived now in formation that spoke of military discipline and absolute unity. The man at their head was older, with silver streaking his beard and eyes that missed nothing. He dismounted his bike with fluid grace and approached the house, removing his gloves with deliberate ceremony. Mrs. Dorothy Williams is a friend of this club, he announced, his voice carrying easily over the idling engines. She's an honored member of our extended family. Anyone who threatens her threatens all of us. From across the street, curtains twitched as neighbors peered out, their faces showing a mixture of fear and fascination. This wasn't the random violence they had been taught to expect from bikers. This was something far more powerful and organized. This was justice. The commotion had drawn official attention as well. Two police cruisers turned on a cedar lane, their lights flashing red and blue against the snow-dusted ground. Someone, probably the same neighbor who had been quick to judge the bikers by their appearance, had called in a disturbance. Officers Janet Rodriguez and Mike Chen stepped out of their vehicles, their trained eyes quickly taking in the scene. The assembled motorcycles, the damaged property visible through Dorothy's open door, and Brandon still clutching a drawer he had obviously been in the process of stealing. "What's the situation here?" Officer Rodriguez asked, her hand resting casually on her radio. Crystal immediately tried to take control of the narrative. "These bikers are threatening us," she began, her voice high with manufacturer panic. "We're just visiting family, and they—" "Ma'am," Officer Chen interrupted, his gaze taking in the overturned furniture, the broken cabinet, and the torn photographs scattered on the hearth. "Are you saying these gentlemen damaged this property?" Tony stepped forward, his voice respectful but firm. "Officers, we responded to a call from Mrs. Williams about a break-in. When we arrived, we found these individuals had already damaged her home and were removing her possessions without permission." Dorothy finally found her voice. "Brandon is my son," she said quietly, the admission clearly painful. "But he and his wife forced their way into my home last night, destroyed my belongings, and took things that didn't belong to them." Officer Rodriguez's expression softened as she looked at Dorothy's tear-stained face and the obvious signs of emotional trauma. "Ma'am, do you want to press charges?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Dorothy looked at her son, really looked at him, taking in his bloodshot eyes, his defensive posture, the way he couldn't quite meet her gaze. This was her baby, the child she had rocked to sleep countless nights, whose scraped knees she had kissed, and whose homework she had helped with until her eyes burned. But this was also the man who had torn apart her wedding photograph and violated the sanctuary of her home. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible. Then, stronger, "Yes, I want to press charges." Within minutes, Brandon was being led toward a patrol car in handcuffs, Crystal following behind in the second vehicle after being informed she would need to answer questions downtown about receiving stolen property. As the police cars pulled away, taking her son out of her life once again, Dorothy felt Tony's gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said softly. "I know he's your son." Dorothy reached up and covered his hand with her own, drawing strength from the contact. "Thank you, Tony. You've done more for me than I can say." She paused, watching the patrol cars disappear around the corner. "But I still hope that someday Brandon will find his way back to the man he used to be." Tony nodded slowly, understanding written across his weathered features. "You're his mother," he said simply. "That kind of love doesn't die, no matter what." The winter that followed was the warmest Dorothy had experienced in years, though not because of any change in the weather. True to their word, Tony, Sarah, and the other Hell's Angels became a constant presence in her life. Not intrusive, but steadily, reliably there when she needed them. They brought groceries when the roads were too icy for her to drive safely, fixed the small things around the house that had been accumulating for years, and most importantly, they filled the silence that had been her constant companion since Robert's death. One evening in early spring, as Dorothy was preparing dinner for what had become a weekly tradition, she heard the familiar sound of Tony's motorcycle in her driveway. But tonight, he wasn't alone. Sarah climbed off the back of the bike, Emma bundled securely in her arms, and Dorothy's heart swelled at the sight of the baby who had grown into a healthy, laughing toddler. "There's my girl," Dorothy called out, opening her arms as Emma toddled toward her with the unsteady gait of a child just learning to walk. They shared dinner around the small wooden table by the stove, pot roast and vegetables, homemade biscuits, and apple pie that filled the house with the scent of cinnamon and love. Emma sat in the old high chair, babbling happily and trying to feed herself with more enthusiasm than success. As Dorothy was clearing the dishes, Tony cleared his throat and reached across the table to take her hand. "Dorothy," he began, his voice unusually serious. "That night when the whole town turned their backs on us, you opened your door without question. You didn't ask who we were or what trouble we might bring. You just saw a family in need, and you helped." He paused, searching her face with eyes that held depths she was still discovering. "I can't be your son, not in the way Brandon is. But if it's all right with you, I'd like to call you Mom." The words were simple, spoken without ceremony or drama, but they hit Dorothy's heart like a physical blow. Tears sprang to her eyes as she realized that this man, this supposed outlaw who society had taught her to fear, was offering her something her own child had taken away. "Oh, Tony," she whispered, rising from her chair to wrap her arms around him. "Nothing would make me happier." Sarah joined their embrace, and for a moment the three of them stood together in the kitchen while Emma clapped her hands in delight at the display of affection. "This little one already calls you Grandma Dorothy," Sarah said with a smile. "Now it's official." As if summoned by her name, Emma stretched her tiny arms toward Dorothy, who lifted her into a hug that encompassed 3 generations of love, chosen rather than biological, but no less real for that fact. The weeks and months that followed brought a steady parade of joy to the little house on Cedar Lane. The Hells Angels made Dorothy an honorary member of their extended family, including her in charity rides and community events that showed her a side of the organization she never could have imagined. She learned that these so-called outlaws organized toy drives for underprivileged children, escorted abused women to court hearings, and stood guard at the funerals of military veterans who had no family to mourn them. Their loyalty was fierce, their brotherhood genuine, and their commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves absolute. Dorothy's house became an unofficial meeting place for the group, a warm haven where tough men and women could let down their guards and simply be human. She found herself cooking for a dozen people most Sunday afternoons, her small kitchen alive with laughter and conversation in a way it hadn't been since Brandon was young. The town's attitude toward both Dorothy and the Hells Angels began to shift slowly, but perceptibly. When Dorothy walked down Main Street now, she was greeted with respect rather than pity. The bikers who had once been viewed with suspicion were now recognized as the people who had helped rebuild the community center after the fire, who had organized the successful fundraiser for the hospital's new pediatric wing. But the most profound change was in Dorothy herself. The woman who had spent 3 years moving through her days like a ghost had rediscovered her purpose. She volunteered at the children's home twice a week, taught Sunday school at her church, and opened her door to anyone who needed shelter, food, or simply someone to listen. Her house became known throughout Riverside as a place where judgment was suspended and kindness ruled. Travelers found warm meals and soft beds. Young mothers received help with their babies, and anyone carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone found shoulders strong enough to help carry it. One crisp morning in November, exactly 1 year after that first desperate knock on her door, Dorothy stood at her kitchen window watching Emma play in a backyard while Tony raked leaves into piles for the toddler to jump in. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line, humming an old hymn that made Dorothy smile with recognition. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so beautifully normal, that Dorothy had to wipe away tears of gratitude. This was what family was supposed to look like. Not the biological accident of shared genes, but the conscious choice to love and support each other through all of life's storms. A knock at her front door interrupted her reverie, and Dorothy opened it to find Officer Rodriguez standing on her porch with an official-looking envelope in her hands. "Mrs. Williams," the officer said with a gentle smile, "I wanted to deliver this personally. Brandon's trial concluded yesterday." Dorothy accepted the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. Inside was a court order mandating that Brandon complete alcohol rehabilitation and anger management classes, along with a restraining order that prohibited him from coming within 500 feet of her property. "He also wrote you a letter," Officer Rodriguez added, handing Dorothy a second, smaller envelope. "His lawyer said he wanted you to have it, but there's no obligation for you to read it if you don't want to." After the officer left, Dorothy sat in her favorite chair by the fire, the letter unopened in her lap. Through the window, she could see Tony teaching Emma how to throw leaves in the air, both of them laughing as the colorful foliage rained down on their heads. Finally, she opened the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper covered in Brandon's familiar handwriting. "Mom, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I just wanted you to know that I remember who I used to be, and I remember the mother who loved me even when I didn't love myself. I'm getting help now, real help, and someday I hope to be the son you deserved all along. Until then, I'm glad you found the family you needed. Love, Brandon." Dorothy folded the letter carefully and placed it in the music box next to the baby's shoes, another piece of hope to be treasured and protected. Through the window, Emma was running toward the house, her cheeks red with cold and excitement, calling Grandma Dorothy. Grandma Dorothy, with all the unbridled joy of a child who knew she was completely, unconditionally loved. Dorothy opened her arms and her heart, ready to catch this precious gift that had literally been delivered to her doorstep on the coldest night of the year. The Hells Angels had kept their promise. They had never forgotten her kindness, and in return, they had given her something more valuable than money or protection. They had given her family. As Emma launched herself into Dorothy's embrace, covering her face with sticky kisses and excited chatter about the leaf piles and the funny faces Tony had been making, Dorothy realized that sometimes the most profound love comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the people society teaches us to fear are exactly the ones who will risk everything to protect us. The fire in her old wood stove crackled with the same warmth it had provided for decades, but now it heated a house filled with laughter instead of silence, with chosen family instead of painful solitude. The Hells Angels patches that had once seemed so threatening now represented loyalty, brotherhood, and the fierce protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. 6 months later, Dorothy received another visitor, one she had been both hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Brandon stood on her porch, clean-shaven and sober, holding a small bouquet of yellow roses, her favorite flowers, the ones Robert used to bring her every anniversary. "Hi, Ma," he said quietly, his eyes clear for the first time in years. "I know I don't have a right to ask, but I was hoping we could talk." Dorothy studied her son's face, seeing glimpses of the boy she had raised beneath the man he had become. The anger was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "You can come in," she said finally. "But Tony and Sarah will be here soon for Sunday dinner. They're part of this family now." Brandon nodded, understanding the unspoken message. If he wanted to be part of her life again, he would need to accept all of it, including the leather-clad bikers who had become the children of her heart. "I'd like that," he said, and for the first time in years, his smile reminded Dorothy of the little boy who used to help her bake cookies on Sunday afternoons. The dinner that followed was awkward at first, with Brandon clearly intimidated by Tony's imposing presence and uncertain how to interact with Sarah and Emma. But as the afternoon wore on and the conversation flowed more easily, Dorothy watched her biological son begin to understand what she had tried to tell him all along. That family isn't defined by blood alone, but by the choice to love and support each other unconditionally. Tony, with the wisdom of someone who had learned not to judge by appearances, gradually included Brandon in the conversation, asking about his work at the rehabilitation center and listening without judgment as Brandon shared his struggles with addiction and anger. "It's not easy," Brandon admitted, accepting a second helping of Dorothy's famous apple pie. "Some days I still want to blame everyone else for my problems. But I'm learning that the only person I can control is myself." Sarah, bouncing Emma on her knee, smiled encouragingly. "Recovery is a journey, not a destination," she said gently. "Tony's sponsor always says that every day is a choice to be better than you were yesterday." Brandon looked surprised. "Tony, you're in recovery too?" Tony nodded without shame. 8 years sober," he said proudly. "Lost everything before I found the program. My job, my first marriage, nearly my life. The Hells Angels saved me by giving me brothers who wouldn't let me give up on myself." As the afternoon sun slanted through Dorothy's kitchen windows, painting golden stripes across the worn linoleum floor, she felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced in decades. Her house was full of voices again, sometimes arguing, sometimes laughing, but always engaged with life in all its messy complexity. Emma toddled from person to person, distributing hugs and babbled commentary with the generous spirit of a child who had never known anything but love. When she reached Brandon, she paused for a moment, studying his face with the serious expression toddlers reserve for important decisions. Then she held up her arms in the universal gesture for pick-me-up. Brandon looked to Dorothy for permission, and she nodded encouragingly. As he lifted Emma into his lap, his expression softened with wonder. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "She looks just like you did as a baby, Ma." Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her son, her prodigal son, hold this child who represented everything good about chosen families and second chances. "She's the granddaughter of my heart," Dorothy said softly. "Just like you're still the son of my heart." no matter what. The Hells Angels continue to be a presence in Dorothy's life, but now they welcome Brandon into their extended family as well. He started attending some of their charity events, using his carpentry skills to help with community projects, slowly rebuilding not just his relationship with his mother, but his sense of purpose and self-worth. Crystal had left him during his time in rehabilitation, taking most of their possessions and leaving only a note saying she couldn't wait for him to get his act together. But instead of driving him back to drink, her abandonment seemed to free Brandon from the toxic influence that had been poisoning his judgment for years. I think I married her because she reminded me of the worst parts of myself, he confided to Dorothy one evening as they worked together in her garden, planting vegetables for the spring. She made me feel like my anger was justified, like everyone else was the problem. Dorothy handed him a packet of tomato seeds, watching as he carefully measured the spacing between plantings with the precision she remembered from his childhood. Sometimes we choose people who reflect what we think we deserve rather than what we actually need, she said wisely. The important thing is that you've learned the difference. As spring turned to summer, Dorothy's house became the unofficial headquarters for what the Hells Angels jokingly called their community outreach program. The basement was converted into a food pantry, stocked with donations from local businesses and club members. The spare bedroom became a temporary shelter for women escaping abusive relationships, complete with a crib for children who needed a safe place to sleep. Dorothy found herself busier than she had been since her teaching days. But it was a good kind of busy, the kind that comes from having a purpose larger than yourself. She coordinated volunteers, managed supplies, and most importantly, provided the kind of motherly wisdom that helped people navigate their darkest moments. One particularly memorable evening, she found herself simultaneously hosting a potluck dinner for 20 Hells Angels, mediating a dispute between two teenage runaways, and babysitting Emma while Tony and Sarah attended a court hearing for another club member who was fighting for custody of his children. As she stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the controlled chaos of people who had become her chosen family, Dorothy caught sight of her reflection in the window above the sink. The woman looking back at her was older than the one who had opened her door to strangers on that frozen night 2 years ago, but she was also more vibrant, more alive, more completely herself than she had been in decades. The Hells Angels had given her more than protection and companionship. They had given her back her sense of purpose, her reason for getting up each morning with enthusiasm rather than resignation. In saving their family, she had found a way to save herself. Late one night, as Dorothy was reading in her favorite chair by the fire, she heard the soft rumble of a motorcycle pulling into her driveway. Through the window, she saw Tony dismounting his bike and walking toward her door with the careful quietness of someone trying not to disturb sleeping neighbors. She opened the door before he could knock. "Is everything all right?" she asked, immediately concerned. Tony's face was streaked with tears, something she had never seen before. "We lost Jimmy tonight," he said simply. "Heart attack. He was only 43. Dorothy opened her arms without hesitation, and this strong, intimidating man who had faced down Brandon's threats without flinching collapsed against her like a child seeking comfort from his mother. She held him while he wept for his lost brother, stroking his hair and murmuring the same soothing words she had used to comfort her students decades ago. "He was going to be Emma's godfather," Tony said when he could speak again. "We had it all planned out. The ceremony, the party afterward. He was so excited about it." Dorothy led him to the kitchen and put the kettle on for tea, performing the ritual of caring that had become as natural as breathing. "Tell me about him," she said gently. "Help me understand what kind of man we've lost." For the next 2 hours, Tony shared stories about Jimmy Rodriguez. Not the Hells Angel, but the man who had volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend, who had taught Sunday school at the Spanish-speaking church downtown, who had been working toward his GED so he could become a paramedic and save lives professionally instead of just as a hobby. "The funeral is going to be huge," Tony said finally, accepting his third cup of tea with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "Jimmy touched a lot of lives, but I wanted you to know first, because you would have loved him. He was the kind of person who saw the best in everyone, just like you do." Dorothy reached across the table and took Tony's hand in both of hers. "Then he was my kind of people," she said firmly. "And any friend of yours is family to me. We'll honor his memory properly." The funeral that followed was unlike anything Riverside had ever seen. More than 200 motorcycles formed a procession that stretched for blocks, their engines providing a thunderous tribute to a man who had lived his short life in service to others. Dorothy rode in the passenger seat of Tony's truck, wearing her best black dress and the braided bracelet Sarah had given her all those years ago. At the graveside service, she stood with Sarah and Emma among the sea of leather jackets, holding the toddler's hand as the priest spoke about a life well lived and love that transcends death. When it came time for the Hells Angels to perform their traditional farewell, a synchronized rev of engines that sent birds flying from nearby trees, Dorothy felt the vibration in her bones and understood it for what it was, a primal cry of grief and celebration combined. After the service, the entire congregation gathered in Dorothy's backyard for the reception, her modest property transformed into a memorial celebration that would have made Jimmy proud. Stories were shared, tears were shed, and gradually, the mood shifted from mourning to celebration as people remembered the joy Jimmy had brought to their lives. Brandon, who had been helping with the food preparation since early morning, approached Dorothy as the sun was setting and the last guests were preparing to leave. "Ma," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about something Jimmy's sister said during her eulogy, about how he never wasted time on regrets because he was too busy making the present count." Dorothy looked at her son, seeing the man he was becoming rather than the boy he had been or the disappointment he had feared becoming. "What are you thinking, honey?" "I'm thinking I want to go back to school," he said, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. "I want to become a counselor, maybe work with people struggling with addiction. I feel like I could help them because I've been where they are." Dorothy's face lit up with pride and hope. "I think that's wonderful, Brandon. Your father would be so proud of the man you're becoming." As the Hells Angels began their procession home, engines rumbling in the gathering dusk, Dorothy stood on her front porch with Tony, Sarah, Emma, and Brandon. Her chosen family and her biological family finally united in something larger than themselves. Emma had fallen asleep in Brandon's arms, her tiny face peaceful and trusting. Sarah leaned against Tony's shoulder, both of them exhausted by the emotional weight of the day, but strengthened by the community that had rallied around them in their grief. "You know what I've learned?" Dorothy said, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "I spent so many years thinking family was something that just happened to you, something determined by blood and circumstance. But real family is something you choose, something you build one act of kindness at a time." Tony nodded, his arm tightening around Sarah's shoulders. "Jimmy used to say that we don't choose our birth family, but we can choose our heart family. You chose us that night when you opened your door, Dorothy, and we'll spend the rest of our lives being worthy of that choice." As the last motorcycle disappeared around the corner and the street fell quiet, Dorothy looked at the little house that had once felt too empty for one person and now regularly hosted dozens of people who had nowhere else to turn. The Hells Angels had kept their promise from that first morning after the storm. They had never forgotten her kindness, and in return, they had given her a life richer than she could have ever imagined. 3 years later, Dorothy Williams celebrated her 76th birthday, surrounded by a family that bore no resemblance to the traditional nuclear unit she had once imagined for herself. The Hells Angels had organized a surprise party in the community center they had helped rebuild, complete with a chocolate cake big enough to feed the entire congregation and a custom-made leather vest with honorary Hells Angel embroidered on the back. Emma, now a precocious 4-year-old, stood on a chair to help Dorothy blow out the candles, her gap-toothed grin identical to the one Brandon had worn at the same age. Sarah was pregnant with their second child, and the baby shower planning was already in full swing, with Dorothy serving as the self-appointed grandmother in charge of spoiling. Brandon had graduated from his counseling program and was working at the same rehabilitation center where he had found his own sobriety. His first client had been a Hells Angel struggling with prescription drug addiction following a motorcycle accident, and the two men had formed a bond that transcended their different backgrounds and similar struggles. As Dorothy looked around the room at the faces that had become her world, leather-clad bikers sharing cake with church ladies, reformed addicts laughing with suburban soccer moms, children from the orphanage playing with Emma, and the other kids who had been embraced by this unconventional extended family, she felt a satisfaction deeper than anything she had experienced in her decades as a teacher or wife or mother. This was her legacy, Not the biological children who might carry on her genetic code, but the community of broken people she had helped heal, one act of kindness at a time. The Hell's Angels might have started as strangers seeking shelter from a storm, but they had become the family that saved her from a different kind of cold, the isolation and purposelessness that had been slowly killing her spirit. Tony approached her during a lull in the festivities, carrying a wrapped package that clearly contained something heavy and meaningful. "This is from all of us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not much, but we wanted you to have something that shows how much you mean to our family." Inside the box was a custom-made wooden plaque, hand-carved with exquisite detail. The inscription read, "Dorothy Williams, Mother, Teacher, Guardian Angel." She opened her door to strangers and gained a family. She gave shelter to the lost and found her purpose. She proved that love has no limits and kindness has no boundaries. At the bottom of the plaque, burned into the wood with careful precision, were the names of every person whose life had been touched by Dorothy's generosity. Not just the Hell's Angels, but the children from the orphanage, the women who had found shelter in her spare room, the neighbors who had discovered that the bikers they feared were actually the protectors they needed. As Dorothy ran her fingers over the carved letters, tears streaming down her face, she thought about that frozen night 3 years ago when 3 desperate strangers had knocked on her door. She had made a choice in that moment, a choice to see past appearances and respond to need with love instead of fear. That single decision had rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves of transformation that were still spreading through the community. The Hell's Angels had become respected members of Riverside society, their charity work and community involvement changing minds and hearts one interaction at a time. The children's home had received enough donations to build a new wing and hire additional staff. Dozens of people struggling with addiction, domestic violence, and homelessness had found not just temporary help, but lasting support through the network Dorothy had helped create. But perhaps most importantly, Dorothy herself had been transformed from a lonely widow, slowly fading away, into a vibrant matriarch presiding over a chosen family that spanned generations, backgrounds, and belief systems united only by their commitment to protecting and caring for each other. As the party wound down and the cleanup began, Dorothy found herself sitting in the same chair where she had first held Emma as a tiny, hypothermic infant. The baby who had been dying in her arms was now a healthy preschooler, helping stack chairs and distribute leftover cake to anyone who wanted to take some home. Tony sat down beside her, his own piece of cake balanced on his knee. "Regrets?" he asked, echoing a conversation they had shared many times over the years. "Only one," Dorothy said, her voice steady and sure. "I regret that it took me so long to understand that family isn't about biology or legal documents or social expectations. It's about choosing to love people exactly as they are and trusting them to love you the same way." Sarah joined them, Emma climbing onto Dorothy's lap with the casual affection of a child who had never doubted her place in the world. "Tell the story, Grandma Dorothy," Emma demanded, settling comfortably against Dorothy's chest. "Tell about the night you saved us." Dorothy smiled, beginning the familiar narrative that had become part of the family mythology, the story of a cold night, a desperate knock, and a choice that changed everything. But as she spoke, she realized that the story wasn't really about her saving them at all. It was about how they had saved each other. The Hell's Angels had given her purpose, family, and protection. She had given them acceptance, sanctuary, and the kind of unconditional love that transforms outlaws into heroes. Brandon had learned to choose sobriety over anger, responsibility over blame. The children at the orphanage had received not just material support, but the knowledge that they were valued and cherished by adults who chose to care about them. Everyone in this story had been broken in some way, by loss, by addiction, by society's rejection, by their own poor choices. But together, they had created something beautiful and strong from the pieces of their shattered lives. As Emma's eyes grew heavy and the last of the party guests made their way home, Dorothy felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived. She had started as a retired teacher living alone in a house too big for one person, marking time until death claimed her. She was ending as the matriarch of a chosen family that numbered in the dozens, a woman whose influence rippled through multiple communities and would continue long after she was gone. The Hells Angels had roared into her life on motorcycles, their leather jackets and intimidating appearance masking hearts full of loyalty and compassion. They had kept their promise to never forget her kindness, and in doing so, they had given her the greatest gift imaginable: the chance to matter, to make a difference, to love and be loved without conditions or limitations. Late that night, as Dorothy sat by her fireplace with Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms, she looked at the wooden plaque propped against the mantelpiece and smiled. The fire crackled with the same warmth it had provided for decades, but now it heated a heart full of joy instead of one slowly freezing from loneliness. Outside, she could hear the distant rumble of motorcycles as the Hells Angels made their way home, their engines singing a lullaby of protection and belonging that would echo through the community until morning came again. The door to 847 Cedar Lane would always be open to those who needed shelter from life storms, because Dorothy Williams had learned the most important lesson of all: that love multiplies when it's shared, and families grow strongest when they're built on choice rather than obligation. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that kindness can come from the most unexpected places, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about the power of human connection. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a tale that might change the way you see the world. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that family is what you make it, and that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with a single act of courage in the face of fear. See you in the next video.